Part 3. Green Eye. A terrible scream split the air. Carrie was huddled in the nursery with Mother, Nana, and her two bridesmaids. A rectangular plexiglass window, cut into the wall below a speaker used to relay the sermon for mothers soothing their bawling infants, allowed her to see into the chapel. Organ music had just begun to play, signaling the guests to their seats and Carrie's entrance, when the horrible scream rang out. Carrie leapt from her chair at the sound and flattened her face against the narrow strip of clear plastic, searching for the source. Through the scratched pane she noticed that a small contingent of guests had left the pews and gathered along the large windows just outside her field of vision. The scream had come from somewhere in that area. She couldn't tell who, but the faces appeared to be focused on something outside. Frustrated, she turned around, as if to follow the gazes, but instead of windows she saw nothing but a scuffed white wall, filled with pinned shapes of cardboard flowers, photographs of baby faces glued to their centers, the tiny bald head sprouting cartoonish petals of gold, red, and blue. "What's happening?" her mother asked, already at the door leading to the foyer, where a tuxedoed usher would momentarily be waiting to escort her out. "I don't know. I can't see," Carrie said, and spun to look once more into the chapel, craning her neck as if it might expose a wider view of the scene. More people were standing now, moving with purpose toward the east-facing windows. Carrie thought a few of them looked alarmed. Despite the commotion, she saw no sign of Parker or Brock at the front of the chapel, just a bemused-looking Pastor Willard. "They should be standing up there by now," she said quietly, and watched as the pastor— "Why does he look so nervous?" she thought, eyeballed his watch, then left the altar to step down toward the pews, speaking hurriedly to the guests. Carrie turned away from the window, confused and concerned, and saw all four women looking at her with expressions rooted in fear. "Something's wrong," she told them. Her mother's crease-worried face suddenly smoothed as if frozen, a hardness that emptied the emotions from her features and made her appear as marble. Carrie noticed Trish take half a step away from her. Beware a mother's love, Carrie thought. "Stay here," her mother said sternly. Carrie felt her protective force, her desire to be sure nothing ruined her daughter's special day, and was comforted at having such a stalwart ally. But Carrie also wondered what exactly was going on. What sort of incident was transpiring outside the church? And would the severity of her mother's ire be any sort of hindrance to its inevitable occurrence? "Now you girls just relax. This is no time to be fussy," Nana said, sitting in a plastic blue chair that was designed for children rather than 83-year-old women. She smoothed her cream dress over her thin knees and pursed her lips. "No reason for fussiness," she reiterated quietly, as if soothing her own nerves as well as those of the young bridal party. Beth pulled Carrie's arm, offered her most disarming smile. "Whatever's going on, just know I love you, and that I'm really happy for you and Parker." Beth gave her a quick hug, then held her at arm's length, eyes beaming confidence. "Don't you worry. Everything is going to be fine." Carrie smiled back, was about to say something in return, something equally assuring, a well-worn platitude, when the sound of an air siren rose in the distance. The high-pitched whine carried across the fields and through the thin white walls of the church to caress the skin of those inside with icy fingers, to flood their hearts and minds with black fear. "Oh no," Carrie said. She gave Beth's hand a squeeze, then a tug. "Come on." Carrie opened the door leading to the shared bathroom, pulling Beth behind her. They ran across the pale porcelain tiles and back into the vestry. They raced to the window, stared in awe at the scene forming outside. Panting, Trish burst into the room just behind them. "What the hell is it?" Carrie stared at the mountain of coal-black clouds suffocating the horizon. The entire sky had turned a spearmint green. Through a gaping hole along the roof of the angry cloud cover, A bright aqua light shone through like a spotlight breaching the surface of the sea, the great eye of an alien god opening within the face of the storm, as if coming awake, as if coming alive. Eli knew he was in deep trouble. Even worse, he'd walked right into it. He'd been fooled by fools, and he should have known better. Parker had hated him for years, and had told him repeatedly, using different means of cruelty and violence, to keep away from Carrie. But now that the two of them were getting married, Eli had figured, with grave miscalculation, that Parker would move on from his childish paranoia, his obsession with Eli and Carrie's friendship. Because that's all it is, he thought, whether I like it or not. Brock grabbed Eli's shoulders and shoved him into the seat facing the pastor's desk. Behind the desk, fingers folded as if preparing to lecture a naughty schoolboy, was a sly-looking and somewhat intoxicated Parker. "Eli," he said dramatically, extending the name comically, almost amiably, as if they were old pals, and Eli had just walked into the same bar Parker had designated as his evening's watering hole. "Eli, Eli, Eli," he went on, slightly slurring the L sounds, and sounding to Eli's ears less amiable with each repetition of the name. "What the fuck are you doing here, boy?" Parker leaned forward, crossed his arms on the desktop, and grinned like a shark. "I mean, I know you and Carrie are friends from kindergarten and shit, but I thought, hell man, I thought you and I had an understanding." Without warning or provocation, Brock punched the back of Eli's head with a knotted fist. White light popped inside his skull, but he gripped the worn wooden arms of the old chair tightly and said nothing. One of the others laughed, and Eli had to fight against rolling his eyes at their sycophancy. Parker strolled magnanimously around the desk. "I mean, shit, man. Last time we had this chat, it ended with you on the ground sucking piss water in the alley behind Tom's bar, remember? God, that was just a few months ago, too. How could you forget that chat, Eli? I know you're dumb, boy." Parker settled himself, ass pressed against the desk, his wrinkled black cummerbund not quite covering the beginnings of a beer paunch at his waist. He bent over and put a firm hand on Eli's shoulder. "But I didn't think you were stupid." Surprising everyone, perhaps himself most of all, Eli sprang up, inadvertently connecting the crown of his head with Parker's nose. There was a loud crack as Parker's head snapped backward as if yanked from behind. Eli twisted and saw Brock coming at him, a mad bull in a very small china shop. In his peripheral vision he saw the other two assholes squeeze their hands into tight fists, but stand firm, at least for the moment. Behind him he could hear muffled cursing, as if Parker was screaming through clenched teeth and tight lips. Eli dared a split-second glance, saw with some satisfaction that the groom was stumbling backward, a hand pressed tightly to his face. Blood spilled down his wrist, soiled the cuff of his pressed white dress shirt. "Motherfucker!" he yelled through the slick palm of his hand, blood spraying between fingers, his watery eyes pinned onto Eli with deadly reprisal. "Hot damn," Eli said under his breath, surprised at the potency of the unintended impact, and bolted for the door. A boulder slammed into the side of his head, and he flew into a wall hung with plaques and a framed visage of Jesus Christ. The impact caused the wall to shudder, and Eli went down, the sharp, heavy corner of Jesus' image smacking into his forehead before flipping flat onto the carpet. Brock's foot stomped onto the glass, cracking Jesus in two, and grabbing Eli by the lapels of his cheap coat pulled him skyward. "Wait for it," Brock whispered, almost calmly, and then a second boulder pounded into Eli's guts. He folded over, breath stolen from his lungs. As he dipped, a black knee shot into the bridge of his nose, and a pistol shot popped in his brain. He collapsed to the floor in a limp heap, doing all he could to keep on hands and knees as he gasped. The room swayed, the frayed carpet blurred and shifting beneath him. He watched with a sort of wonder as a trail of blood dotted the coarse fabric beneath his face. Reflexively, a pure survival instinct, Eli shifted the air around him. Someone kicked him in the side, but it hardly registered. One of the smaller ones must have done it. A coward's move. "He's fucking hard as stone," a voice said. Afraid to be hurt, but more afraid of arousing suspicion, Eli let go of the air and immediately felt himself sag, as if his body had gained 100 pounds of pain. "You're just a pussy," a deeper voice said, and another kick came, this one heavy and pointed, dipped in the slick sheen of a tuxedo shoe. This time the attack connected. Pain burst through Eli's side. He felt a rib crack as he crashed to the floor, sucking desperately for breath. He clutched his guts, his chest, and wanted to bellow for help before things got worse. Part of him knew he could end this now. Bring up fire and wind and drive them away, through walls if he must. "And reveal yourself?" a voice asked. A voice that lived deep within the chambers of his heart. A voice that sounded suspiciously like a teenage Carrie Foster. "Attack my future husband? That would make my day memorable, wouldn't it? The groom on fire, screaming bloody murder as groomsmen were blown down the aisle, While the organ played Vicente Avella, perhaps?" Eli rolled onto his back, terrified, slowly pulling thin ribbons of oxygen into his lungs. "Okay," he croaked, not knowing if his words were loud enough to hear, if they were being spoken at all. "Okay," he repeated more clearly this time. 4 white faces appeared above him, all staring down at the shell of the man he'd become, the tattered remnants of his human spirit. Parker's chin was slathered in blood. His nose had swelled and was heading toward a dark shade of purple, but there was nothing Eli could do about that now. "Okay, what, asshole?" Parker growled, his eyes clear once more, his teeth clenched. Eli raised a hand toward those faces, as if warding off evil spirits. "Okay, I'll leave," he said as loud as he could muster, certainly audible. "I'll leave," he repeated, then added, "Forever, okay?" He fought back a sob, then said it again, as much as for himself as for them, knowing he meant it. "I'll leave forever." Brock looked to Parker, who said nothing. Tuck pulled at Brock's arm. "We need to go, man. The wedding is, starting." But Brock only squeezed his meaty fingers into thick, hairy-knuckled fists, and Eli thought that maybe things like reason and schedule and marriage vows were no longer at the forefront of the brothers' minds. Eli rose slowly to his knees, hands still raised in mock defense, in total surrender. "I'll go, man. You're supposed to be getting married. What about Carrie? What about her? Don't you give a shit about her? This is supposed to be Parker arched his back and shot his leg out like a piston, slamming the heel of his shoe into Eli's face. Eli felt his nose crack and twist, his jaw shift unnaturally, some string of key muscle and cartilage tearing free from the hinge. 2 hard, jagged teeth rolled loosely onto his tongue. White light fluttered in his mind like a strobe, and his eyes rolled back into his head. Eli sank like dead weight, his body limp, his brain scrambling for consciousness. Blood ran freely from one nostril, his lip was badly split, and red saliva drooled from the corner of his mouth, down his cheek, and onto the urine-stained carpet. He gagged on the trickle of warm blood sliding down his throat, coughed once, spitting out at least 1 tooth in the process, then sickly swallowed. His face was numb, his nerves bullied into a state of shock. He knew he'd been badly, badly hurt. Parker knelt in front of him, madness in his eyes, and Eli hated himself for the fear that leapt into his chest, the instinctive squeeze of his bladder whose release he fought against with every fiber of self-worth left in him. He lifted his hands, pleading, please," he said, more terrified than he'd ever been. Even more scared than the time they'd beaten him in the alley behind that bar, the same night Carrie had told him of her engagement. The night he knew his life with her was over. It was then that Parker had first warned him to stay clear of Carrie, of his best friend, of the very one he was supposed to protect. But he couldn't protect anyone. That had been made painfully clear. First that night in the alley, and now in this small, stinking office of the small church. Eli had never felt more despair. He had never felt more hollow. He dropped his hands and sighed, deciding it no longer mattered what they did to him. All the damage had been done, and he was broken inside. Shattered glass and shadows. He rolled over and hoped for a moment to rise, but instead let his face sink into the musty carpeting, too hurt to do anything more. "Think he's had enough," Brock's voice. Eli could imagine him putting a hand on his brother's arm. "Let's get you cleaned up and get this shit over with." Eli scoffed, kept his face to the carpet. A tear pooled in his eye and he didn't fight its departure. "Not yet," Parker said. And just as Eli was thinking what part of him they would attack next, was wondering with a sense of inquisitive fascination if Parker meant to actually kill him, he heard a loud scream from outside the door. "What the hell was that?" One of the dickheads. "I don't..." Brock started, then stopped. They all stopped. Because that was when they heard the air siren, and the mounting screams that followed the first, hot on its wailing heels. Pastor Willard raised his arms and yelled over the heightening voices, the weeping children, the discordant shouts of panic, the distant warning cry of the siren. "Please, please be calm!" The interior of the chapel had taken on a green hue, reflecting the light coming in through windows, now filled with the most ominous sky he had ever seen. Where did this weather come from? He thought, pushing the sudden burn of fear deep down while praying silently to his God. Faces turned to him, pale and alarmed. "We need to get out of here," one man said. "Pastor, what should we do?" asked a pretty lady in a blue dress, her arm clamped onto the narrow bicep of an elderly man, who seemed confused as to what all the yelling was about. Pastor Willard stepped forward, looked through the large windows at the building's storm, the strange light that shone through the center of the sky's cloud-wrinkled face. "Let's just take our seats, please. Come on, this will be better if we remain calm." He smiled at them reassuringly, his sheep looking to him for guidance, for someone to lead. "Come on now, let's..." His words were cut off as the roof of the church erupted in a hard clattering that echoed ominously throughout the open chapel, filling the room with a cacophonous, nerve-shattering racket. An image came to him of 1,000 baby demons, born of the storm and formed by ice, banging their fists on the roof and walls of the Lord's house, commanding entry, demanding souls to take. "What is it?" a child yelled. But the others said nothing, simply looked toward the ceiling as if waiting for it to cave inward, allow full access to the battering sky. "It's hail," the pastor said quietly. Then, clearing his throat and repeating the words with assertion, "It's just hail." He searched the group for faces he knew, for someone he could trust. He spotted the Marksons, who were smarter than most and had run a cattle farm in the county for decades. He decided to deputize them both. "Martha, Tom, come on, you've both seen hail before. We all have." Tom Markson nodded, as if trying to figure out why the pastor was addressing him specifically. Then realization come upon him. He looked to his wife and nodded as she immediately started touching the shoulders of children, whispering reassuringly. "That's right," Tom said, nodding ever more vigorously. "That's just hail, folks. I think we should all have a seat like the pastor said." Pastor Willard smiled, feeling as if things were coming to hand, when he happened to glance over the heads of the group and out the large windows, toward the beating heart of the storm. Lightning flashed, illuminating the sunken dark shadows of the tumultuous clouds, revealed what lay hidden there. A massive, twisting funnel extended down from the ceiling of boiling sky, pushed its way earthward. The tip of it curled like a witch's finger, digging a hard gray fingernail across the earth. The pastor could see, through a swirl of dirt at the twister's base, black specks rising from the ground to feed it, pulled upward like confetti falling in reverse. Those are corn stalks, he thought. But deep down, sulking within his hidden subconscious, where nightmares fester and all our greatest fears are harbored, was the truth. Cars, his subconscious shrieked, piercing his brain like an ice pick. Houses, livestock, and then, people. Oh no. The words fell from his mouth like a dead prayer, and all heads followed his wide-eyed gaze out the windows. And inside the small church, hell broke loose. Carrie saw the funnel and clutched Beth's hand in a fierce grip. Behind them, through the door that led to the chapel, came raised voices. Alarm. Pastor Willard was speaking loudly, urging for calm. "We have to get out of here," she said, surprised at how level, how reasonable her voice sounded, when inside panic whipped through her chest and stomach, faster and more urgently than the thrashing storm outside. "We need to get to the cars and get the hell away," she said more insistently, as if giving instructions to hardened soldiers instead of scared bridesmaids wearing dresses of cauliflower blue. Beth and Trish nodded. Fear held fast in their eyes, but their mouths were set with determination and forced calm. Trish grabbed her clutch and tucked it beneath a bared arm. Carrie had a beat to think how beautiful she looked in that moment. "I don't have anyone here. I'll take your mom and Nana with me," Trish said, then hesitated. "Where do we go? We should meet—" Carrie thought for a moment. "City Hall," she said, remembering what she'd been taught as a child, if ever caught in a storm near town. "There's a shelter at City Hall." "Why don't you come with us?" Trish asked, already moving for the door. "I have to find Parker. I'll leave with him," she said, the words coming automatically. She tasted the lie on her tongue as she spoke it, and was surprised at what her true thoughts were, the face her mind conjured the second she realized the peril was real. That their lives were in danger. "I have to find Eli." She pulled Beth's arm and went quickly through the door, Trish already ahead of them and calling for the older women to get in motion. Carrie entered the nursery to loud voices. Trish was gently lifting a complaining Nana from a chair in the corner, and her mother was at the door, yelling at both of them, tears in her eyes. "I don't understand. Carrie, what's happening?" "A tornado, Mom, just east. A big one." "Oh my God," her mother said, then held a breath, sniffed, and straightened. "Okay, let's all go, come on." "I'll meet you," Carrie said, and went to her mother and hugged her fiercely. "I'll go with Parker. I'll be fine. Now come on." Carrie yanked open the door that led to the foyer. She had one last moment to think, despite her fear and the impending danger, that her wedding day was over, vanquished in an instant. There were no ushers to take her elbow and lead her to the aisle, no turned, expectant faces watching her step gracefully through the small chapel, toward the handsome groom, the smiling pastor. There would be no veil covering her face, no ring on her finger, no vows spoken. They stepped out of the nursery. Directly across the foyer at the end of a short hallway, another door swung open, breaking Carrie's momentary reverie. A man walked out. Parker. He stopped short, met her eyes, then looked down and away, as if ashamed. She noticed his face was smeared with, "Is that blood?" Behind him came Brock. He saw Carrie and froze, mouth agape, as if already searching for an excuse to whatever new mess they'd gotten into. She took a small step to the side, just slightly, in order to make out what lay on the floor through the open door behind them. A shock of blonde hair. A face, bloodied and beaten, resting against the carpet, one blue eye wide and then wider. "Oh God, no!" She took a step forward, her face already burning with the heat of fury, her heart pumping hard beneath the white fabric of her tight dress. Parker was already raising a hand toward her, as if to say, "Now, just wait a second, it's not what you think, baby." Carrie had just started across the foyer, fingers squeezed into tight fists, when Pastor Willard strode between them, a large group of wedding guests on his heels, quickly filling the space between bride and groom. Tears spilled down Carrie's cheeks as she tried to cross the space, push through them toward Parker, toward the bloodied Eli that lay hurting on the office floor. The pastor had been heading for the exit, but stopped when he saw Carrie fighting her way toward him. His alarmed face went slack with worry. "Carrie, darling, it's okay. Look, I know this all seems horrible right now, but it's going to be all right. Please don't cry," he said, and gripped her by the arms, held her fast. She looked at him in amazement. "It's not that." But he only nodded, squeezed her arms so tight she felt the pain of his hard thumbs digging into her biceps. "I know you're scared, honey, but there's nothing to worry about. We just need to get to shelter, underground." Outside, the wind grew with such force that the building shook and rattled. The warning siren still wailed, but it was muffled now by the battering hail and the whipping howl of the wind. The front doors of the church began to clatter, as if poltergeists were on the other side, slapping their ghostly hands against the sun-bleached wood from their mad purgatory, desperate to reach the living. "Damn," Pastor Willard whispered, and released his hold on Carrie. He raised his arms up high, addressed his gathered flock. "All right, folks, let's do this orderly now. We got time. Let's get to the cars safely and get to the shelter in town. That's the safest place." "I got a storm cellar a half-mile from here," yelled Mr. Daniels, who owned a modern ranch up Route 33, settled nicely within 300 acres and 100 head of milking cows. "I can fit at least 20 of us." Pastor Willard nodded, as if placating a child who was showing off his newest finger painting. "That's fine, Bob, just fine. Now let's move orderly, okay?" The church doors battered their frames, harder by the second, the wind screeching outside the thin walls like a swarm of banshees. Pastor Willard nodded to his flock one last time, turned, and stepped briskly to the entrance. He pushed the armbar that unlatched the door. There was a sharp bang that made Carrie jump despite the other commotion. The door had whipped open, torn from the pastor's hands and slung hard against the outside wall by a violent slap of wind. "Oh!" he cried, and reached for it, as if to pull it closed again. People began to surge, to shove at him from behind. "Just wait a damn second!" he roared, trying to be heard over the tumult. The wind pushed his silver hair away from his head, flowers blew off a nearby table, and Mrs. Halliman's wide-brimmed hat flipped and soared like a wobbling flying saucer back toward the chapel. Hail spattered the floor of the entryway, sprinkling across the blue-gray carpet of the foyer like beads spilled from a pearl necklace. Something outside cracked louder than thunder. A hand grabbed Carrie's arm and tugged her backward. She had time to see the pastor struggling with a man in a dark blue suit. A woman was fighting to get past them both, pulling a little blonde-haired boy with her, the terrified child screaming at the top of his lungs. The roof above Carrie's head exploded. The wall above the doors burst inwards with a plume of drywall dust and splinters, blasting a crowd of debris into the foyer. The mighty oak had been ripped free of its poisoned roots, and now finished its fall, the enormous trunk crashing against the aged doors with the bulk and velocity of a school bus dropped from the sky. Pastor Willard, the man in the blue suit, and the woman holding the hand of her tow-headed child evaporated in a floor-shaking crunch. A dousing spray of red mist decorated the people surging forward in crimson, coating their faces, their fine dresses and suits. Carrie fell hard to the ground, pulling Beth down with her, and noticed her dress had gone from white to pink. The blood that burst from the crushed bodies of the pastor and the others like juice from a fat grape, had coated her from toe to chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but was surprised, and a touch concerned, when nothing came out but an incoherent wheeze. The reasonable part of her brain, the logical override that had been flipped to extinguish the unbelieving sensory organs, stared blankly at the exit, now blackened by the bark of an oak tree high as a man, littered with pieces of church. And church-goers, part of her mind insisted. But she shoved that thought away, let logic take the controls once more. "As you can see, dear," logic said, its inner voice steady, almost relaxed in its precision. "The exit, quite obviously, is now blocked, and time, I fear, is of the essence." "There's a door in the back," someone yelled. But now things seemed lost. Carrie realized, quite lucidly, that things had suddenly spiraled completely out of control. The panicked mob surged back toward the chapel, colliding with those who had either waited patiently or were trying to push their way into the foyer to see what the hell had happened. The two forces collided, and there were more screams, men yelling, children crying, women clawing to get through, to get back, to get out. Carrie felt arms reach around her waist from behind and try to lift her to her feet. But she couldn't move, couldn't think of what to do with her legs, with the muscles of her body. "How do I stand?" she thought, and looked at her blood-smeared hands in a daze, as if the answers were written upon dripping palms. She watched emotionless as a little girl in a pink dress and white leggings was pushed into the edge of a pew, her head smacking the dense wood hard enough that Carrie heard the thud of impact amidst the chaos. The girl fell to the ground and was stomped upon like a rag doll. Her mother, Mrs. Baker, I think. Yes, Mrs. Baker, my senior high school teacher. I loved her. She always brought in cookies on Fridays. Was trying to yank the girl to her feet, screeching and baring her teeth at the others crowding past her in a frenzy for escape. More hands grabbed Carrie, and this time she was able to find her feet, allow herself to be lifted from the floor. Her mother stared at her, shook her, pleading, "We've got to go, honey. We've got to get out of here." Carrie nodded and started to let herself be pressed toward the chapel, where the crowd heading toward the back had soundly defeated those who had been heading toward the front. She spun her head back toward the hallway, toward the office where she had seen Eli lying on the floor. But she could not move, could not free herself as she was shoved mercilessly forward, into the chapel where people were filling the aisle, tearing to shreds the white paper runner that had been laid for her walk to the altar. Others were climbing over the backs of pews, rushing toward a distant door. The tall, arched windows that lined the east side of the church burst inward as one. Shards of glass flew like a hail of bullets towards those trapped inside. More screams rang out, and a few people collapsed, grabbing at their heads, at legs, at necks. One woman had both hands over her face, an inhuman howl coming from within, blood spurting between her knuckles. "Oh no!" her mother screamed from beside her. "Oh God, no!" Carrie turned toward the windows. The view of sky and cornfields had been obliterated by a funnel wider than a football field. It filled the world. She watched in stunned amazement at its sheer power, at the fibrous musculature of the churning air, blackened and pulsing and hungry. God help them, it was hungry. The building shook, and Carrie saw pieces of the church vanish, sucked away, pulled toward this embodiment of Earth's vengeance, this smoky, churning fist of a deadly god. She raised her eyes to the ceiling as part of the chapel's roof blew apart and vanished. Those nearest the gaping hole were pulled into the air as if lifted by invisible rope. There was another surge of bodies, and Carrie was shoved to the floor between two pews. Beth and her mother fell with her. They clutched at each other, as if one of them had the power to save the other. Then the east wall of the church disappeared, replaced by a broad veil of indescribable force, the thick, foul funnel having finally arrived, late to the ceremony. The siren wailed as if from a distant harbor, The office windows rattled ceaselessly with the force of hurricane-force gusts, and the sounds of panic from the foyer made evident what was happening to the wedding guests. Parker and his mates had heard it as well, and their interest in Eli waned with each passing sound of the growing tumult, both outside and inside the small church. "What the hell's going on out there?" Brock asked, his foot resting with almost nonchalance on the back of Eli's suit coat, pushing his belly into the ground. "Storm," Tuck said. Parker looked down at Eli, then at his brother. "You think it's bad?" Brock shrugged and turned his bulbous head toward the screams coming from the foyer, just outside the pastor's door. "Shit," he said. Parker nodded, stepped over Eli and opened the door to the office. Brock removed his heel from Eli's back and followed. "There," Eli thought, the very sight of her a jolt of hot current to his brain. "Carrie." From his vantage point on the floor, his head swimming, his jaw throbbing painfully, he saw past the legs of the brothers and into the lobby. He saw Carrie standing white as an angel, more radiant and beautiful than he'd ever thought possible. He would have smiled if the muscles of his jaw had deigned to respond to his brain's commands. He watched the pastor take her by the arms. Then a swarm of people surged into his line of sight, and she was pulled away. The roof above was being beaten by hail, and the winds, already at a seemingly impossible pitch, were picking up speed. Eli forced himself to his elbows, then his hands and knees. Tuck ran out the door, following the brothers who had disappeared into the thicket of guests crowding toward the exit, like a dressed-up murder of hungry crows fighting for a spill of fresh guts. Eli heard more yelling, then the loud crack of a slamming door. He put a hand to the desk to steady himself, stood shakily. He heard a whimper and looked down to see Henry huddled on the floor in the corner of the room, hands between his knees. My God, he's praying. As if realizing he was not alone, Henry looked up at Eli, his eyes white eggs of fear. "I always hated storms," he said, his hands visibly trembling. "Even as a child, I had a recurring nightmare. Night terrors, really, of a storm blowing me away. A tornado eating me up. I can't—" But an enormous crash from the foyer drowned out his words and shook the building. Henry screamed, then moaned loudly. Eli was sure the kid had wet himself, but couldn't find the time to care, because through the open door he watched the entire front of the building crash inward, saw the gnarled limb of a giant tree stick its length into the church foyer, as if reaching for a life to take. Blood was everywhere. People were screaming full-throated and pushing away from the doors back into the church. "Carrie!" he yelled. He had just taken his first step toward the chapel, toward the destruction, when a hand clutched his leg. He looked down to see Henry holding him back, still crying, yelling something about being alone, about being taken away. Heat built in Eli's chest, and with wide red-rimmed eyes he bound ropes of air tightly around Henry's body that raised him from the floor, his arms and legs locked, his eyes slipping from fear to shock to horror. "Eli!" he shrieked, eyes wide with shock. Eli's lip dipped into a snarl, and with a singular thought he pushed. Henry's body flew backward hard enough that his palms met his shoe tips. He crashed through the window like a foul ball and was swallowed by the raging storm. More shouts rang out, mingled with the sounds of the building being ripped apart. The jet engine whine of the great whirlwind had fully manifested, devouring and destroying all in its path. Without a second thought, Eli ran toward it. It was the loudest thing she had ever heard, could imagine ever hearing. It was as if the entire world was being torn to atoms, ground to dust. The wind roared, and although she knew she was screaming so loud she could feel the pain in her throat and the burn in her lungs, she could not hear herself, could not hear the cries of the others, could hear nothing at all save the wind, so deafening as to make her vision shake with the force of it. Still flattened against the floor, Carrie turned onto her side. Beth's face stared back at her. She was yelling something, eyes wild with fear. Carrie looked away from her, from those terror-filled eyes, and toward the aisle. She saw the approaching wall of the cyclone and knew she would soon be dead. People had stopped running and were now holding on to anything they could lay hands on. The ends of the pews, the altar, each other. There was the sense of an unveiling, and Carrie looked up to see the roof of the church peel away like the lid of a soup can. The sky above was demonic, the ceiling of hell itself. Black, pulsing clouds shoved and jostled against each other, filled the dark green heavens. Hail and rain fell in a deluge through the open ceiling, soaking those inside within seconds. Carrie sat up, then tried to stand. She had to run, to escape. A hand gripped hers and tried to pull her back. She turned and saw her mother hiding under a pew, reaching for her, beckoning her to lie with her, to be with her at the end of everything. The air inside the church, or what was left of it, was circulating like a blender at high speed. Pieces of wood and glass filled the air. As Carrie watched in a sort of senseless shock, distantly aware of the mosquito bite pain of debris cutting her arms, legs, and face, a red pickup truck crashed through the rear wall as if thrown like a child's toy, decimating the 12-foot cross that hung there, and crunching grill first into the large altar. The small cluster of people that had been clutching at the slab were crushed or thrown. A small old lady, stripped to her underwear, flew toward the missing east wall and never found the ground. She simply traveled higher and higher, spinning, white limbs flapping through the air and into the sky until she vanished within the immense funnel, as if sucked into it through a giant straw. More of the wedding guests were being lifted away, and Carrie could feel her dress, her long, beautiful bridal dress, being pulled toward the vortex. She hurriedly studied what was left of the church interior, hoping to see Eli one last time before it was over, to say she was sorry, perhaps to say she'd been wrong. Instead, she saw the man she was to marry, and with emotionless cool she watched as Parker and Brock threw people aside as they pushed their way toward the front of the sanctuary. Before they made it halfway, there was a blur of brown, and a honed splinter of wood the size of a baseball bat slammed into Brock's chest, opening him like a red mouth, rib bones for teeth. Parker groped for him as he fell, then looked around in a panic as if someone could help, as if anyone could be helped or spared. For a moment they made eye contact, but Carrie saw nothing in his eyes but fear. He thrust his arms up over his head, warding off the singeing splinters of wood and glass. She watched, with that same sensation of numbness, as her own Nana grabbed him around the waist. To his credit, he embraced her, as a flailing limb of the storm swept across the pews, snatched them from the earth, and tore them away. No longer able to watch, Carrie spun and dropped to her knees, wanting to hold her mother once more before it was too late. She looked at the floor where Beth and her mother had been only moments ago, but the space underneath the pew was empty. They were gone. But how, she thought, and an icy cold shook her. She slumped and let go of her feelings, of her life, felt it drain out of her like sand. Deep down, she hoped maybe they'd escaped, found a way out, a miracle. The cyclonic mass was here now, and it was time. The beast roared in triumph, bellowed with enough violent force that Carrie's hearing became buried beneath a high-pitched whistle as the great god of destruction bore down on its final sacrifice. She felt herself sliding toward it. Her mind, her thoughts, her fears were consumed completely by the mad howl of the monster. She put her hands over her eyes, closed them tight. She did not want to see the end of her life. And then, from one heartbeat to the next, silence. Carrie. Hands landed lightly on her waist, just above her hips and bent knees. The thunderous roar of the storm had stopped. No, Not stopped, muted. The ringing in her ears remained, but the pull of the wind had vanished. The sounds of death, of nature's fury, were nothing but dim white noise. "Carrie, look at me, please." "Is this God?" she thought. "Is this what happens when you die?" Gentle hands moved from her waist to her wrists, pulled her hands from her face. "Open your eyes." Carrie did, and joy swelled in her heart. Eli sat before her, his face bloody and already bruising, his beautiful smile slanted to one side and gapped by 2 missing teeth. She smiled back at him, briefly in relief and with a mad surge of love, wanting to hug him, to touch him. But she saw something else in his face beside the pain, that crooked smile. He was shaking, and his hands, though gentle, were tight on her wrists with tension. Despite her shock, and her happiness at seeing him, at holding him, she could not resist turning to look behind her, madly hoping the storm was impossibly gone, hoping she would see only blue sky and a green harvest splitting the horizon. But it was there, filling every inch of her vision, the great writhing face of the twister ready to feed. "Don't look at it, Carrie. Look at me," he said quietly, his voice soft and clear, as if they were lying side by side on a cool autumnal night, watching the stars. "Keep your eyes on me." She did, and looked upon him with wonder. The cyclone that had consumed the church now completely surrounded them. They knelt, each facing the other, holding on almost peacefully before the approach of the swirling colossus. Carrie could not feel it, could not hear its frustrated wailing as they passed, somehow, into the funnel. The world went black as they slipped inside the great heart of the beast, and she was spared by deep shadow, the sight of meat and metal flying furiously around them, bouncing off the surface of the protective bubble, vanishing into the folds of wind. An insane fury encapsulated them, and if she had looked up, she dared not, Carrie would have seen a great green eye staring down at her from the heavens, glowing bright with cosmic hate, with its frustrated desire to consume. "Close your eyes," he said, his voice muffled, his breathing heavy, "and know that I love you." She obeyed, relishing the peace of her own darkness, the silence of his protection. He held her slim wrists tightly, and they waited together, not speaking, as death passed them by. After 100 rapid beats of her heart, after minutes that seemed without end, the world finally lightened from complete black to a shadowy gray. The edge of the tornado licked at their protective shield with its last deadly whips before moving past, off to find other victims, other worlds to rent and tear. Carrie could stand it no longer. She wanted to grab Eli fiercely, pull him to her despite her fear of distracting his focus. She needed him to know what she felt for him, what part of her had always felt for him. And so she opened her eyes and screamed. Carrie screamed in fright, in horror, in absolute despair. Her body and soul emptied itself with her cries, gutting her. A sorrow she had never known, a maddening pain tore at her heart. Eli knelt before her still, but his pale skin sagged on his bones, as if the fat and muscle inside him had melted away. His eyes were gone, replaced by blue water, twinkling in his sockets like the surface of a creek. It poured down his cheeks in an impossible constant flow. "Eli, let go!" she yelled, and could already feel the pocket of air around them dissipating, the noise of the departing twister growing steadily louder. He shook his head, and she thought maybe he might have smiled one last time. He opened his mouth as if to say goodbye, but only dark sand poured from between his lips. The skin covering his hands grew hot, and she tenderly pulled her wrists free with a wince, saw the red bands around her arms, the charred lace of her dress where he'd held her. Parts of his flesh sparkled with yellow flame, and where it met water, steam rose in silky tethers.
"Eli, let go! Let go! Please let go!"
she screamed, for the world had returned and she could feel the rain once more, the playful push of now harmless gusts of wind in her hair, heard the rumbling of the dying storm.
"I love you, Eli! My blue eyes! Oh no, please no!"
She wept and pressed what remained of him to her chest, felt the heat of the flames eating his skin, smelled his flesh in the smoke. The water that poured from his eyes ran cool over her neck. His suit sagged in her arms, then collapsed in the growing pile of warm mud that had once been her only true friend. She lifted her eyes from him only once, to watch the monster moving away off into the distance, a black mountain of cornstalks rising through the air to feed it, to serve. Carrie looked down through a distorted lens of tears at what remained, pushed her hands into the charred, wet fabric of the suit. Sobbing, she laid her body flat to rest with him. She kissed the mud, let it stick to her face and hands, mingle with her blood and tears. She smelled the deep minerals of his lost body, the enchanted elements of earth mixed with his sacrifice, with the magic of first love, with love forever lost.